Welcome back to week 2 of the Markidini Crochet Along. This week we're going to be working on this part of the large first block. So last week we did this section over here, so we're working on this section here. Before we get to these blocks, we want to find our swatch and do a bit more work on that. So in the introduction, we learned about the Tunisian simple stitch, TSS, the purl stitch, and the knit stitch. And last week we used all 3 of those stitches to make our blocks. We also talked about binding off and then attaching behind those bind off stitches. So this week we are going to learn another new stitch before we get into our blocks. So this stitch is called the Tunisian reverse stitch. It is very similar to the TSS, the simple stitch. So the simple stitch, we insert our hook through that vertical loop, yarn over, and pull up a loop. That's the simple stitch. Reverse stitch is exactly the same, only instead of picking up the loop on the front, we pick up the vertical loop on the back. So to show you on the video, if I hold it separately like that, you can see the front loop and this back loop peeking through. So we want to put our hook in back of our work and go around or through that back vertical loop to pick up our loop. So from the back, picking up. So it's still under the vertical loop, except our hook is working from the back and going through the back loop instead of the front loop. So we'll just work our way down this side here, picking up. We'll pick up 13 of these loops, and the first loop will give us 14, and then I'll show you the border stitch as well for a total of 15 loops for our swatch. So again, this will give a little bit of a different texture or look from the front. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. The border loop we will pick up as usual, going through both of those side loops and pulling up. And then we'll work our return pass. So our usual return pass is pull through 1, yarn over, pull through 2 all the way. Last week, remember, I did show you an alternate where you can yarn over and pull through 2 right away, and it just closes that hole just a little bit between the border stitch and our next stitch. So we work the return pass all the way down the row, and we're going to work a few rows of this reverse stitch. So that first one can be a little bit tricky to maneuver your way behind. So you just want to make sure that you snug up this first loop after you find that first one, because it will sometimes stretch and it'll be really loose, which we don't like. And here's an example of one of my loops that I didn't tighten, and you can see how it's a lot larger than my other side loops and not as neat. So the reverse stitch again, just like TSS, only we're working on the back side of those stitches and picking up that back vertical loop. Okay, if you did the pull through 2 right away, make sure you get that last stitch before the border stitch as well, that we don't miss that one. And then we'll work our return pass. and that's the TRS Tunisian reverse stitch. So you can work a few more rows of that until you're comfortable with that. So far on our swatch, our stitches have all been a very solid fabric that we create. And a lot of people typically associate that with Tunisian crochet, that it's very solid and dense fabric. We're now going to learn a couple of techniques to have a bit more open spaces in our Tunisian crochet, or to form, or these stitches can be used to form an haut-jour, which means a lace pattern. So we will be using these in our week 2 blocks as well. So the first one is a very simple one. We TSS in the first stitch, and then we yarn over and skip the next stitch. TSS in the next, yarn over, skip the next. So the yarn over is the loop of where we're skipping, and then you can already see how that creates a bit of an open space or hole in our work. So always skipping the stitch, yarn over, skip the stitch. Oops, I didn't skip the stitch. Yarn over, skip a stitch, pull up a loop. Yarn over, skip a stitch, pull up a loop. Yarn over, skip a stitch, pull up a loop. And then we'll pick up our border stitch as well. Then we'll work our return pass. Now, what we need to be careful on our return pass is that that yarn over counts as a loop. So we pull through 2, and that was the yarn over, pull through 2, and that was the TSS. Pull through 2. Okay, so I worked fairly loosely on this round. Sometimes it can get stretched out a fair bit, so you want to be careful to keep your stitches that your hook slides but not too loose as well. Now to work the following row, so we can already see how that's much more opened up and not near as solid a work as we've had previously. So depending on the pattern, what we want to do as we work the next row, sometimes we will work into the space that is created to pull up our next loop. Sometimes we will actually work into the yarn over, or the return pass, so that chain to pick up our loop at the top, and so on. And sometimes you actually pick up the yarn over loop and pull it up. So it just depends on what we're doing for the next row. So next we're just going to insert our hook into this large hole that was created when we did the yarn over. It's like a Tiki S or the knit stitch, because you can see the front of the yarn over loop and the back behind, and where we enter is between the two of those. So we just pull up a loop in that hole, TSS in the next. Okay, so likewise on this row we want to be very careful with our tension. I can tell that I worked my first row quite loosely, and the holes are a little bit bigger than we want. So we will get used to that tension as we work a few extra practice rows before we get to our square. So we were just TSS in each of the stitches across and picking up a loop in the hole that was created by the yarn over. And regular return pass. And then the next row again would be where we make the yarn overs to create that open or lace section. So TSS in that first stitch, yarn over, skip a stitch, TSS in the next stitch, yarn over, skip a stitch, TSS, yarn over, skip a stitch, TSS, yarn over, oops, I missed one, yarn over, skip a stitch, TSS, yarn over, skip, TSS in that last stitch, and then pick up our border stitch and return pass. And then the next row again is like row 2 where we TSS there, pick up a loop in the space, TSS, pick up a loop in the space. So you can continue that down the row. And then each row, remember, just works a regular return pass. And so it's a 2-row pattern to get to this effect, but you can see how it's a much more open and lacy effect than our previous stitch patterns have been. So you can work that a few more times until you're comfortable, and then I'll meet you back here for our block number 5. Block 5 is based on a knitting pattern that the designer found. We're going to be following the chart again for it. This is a fairly large block compared to the ones we have done before, but we'll help you get started on the first few rows and help you with the chart. So when you find the chart in the written pattern, you will actually need 2 pages. The second page just continues from the first. The chart makes it look larger than it is, remembering every little box or square is a stitch, and it shows both the forward and the return pass. So we're going to be using, in this week's square, or block number 5, we will be using the TSS, TKS, TRS, which was that new one, the reverse stitch, and the open space stitch, which we were practicing as well. And this black circle signifies the yarn over. And we were familiar with the return stitch and the border stitch from last week. So taking our yarn, we want to attach to the side edge, the border edge, and make a chain. So again, we're going to be working in, we'll be attaching, connecting in these back bumps here. So to attach our yarn, we want to find a different back loop. Now to start, we will be chaining 47. 1, 2, 3, 4. So when you have chained 47, remember we will turn it to the back side and carefully pick up in the back bump of that very first stitch and pull up a loop. And we'll continue down the row until we have pulled up a loop in each stitch, and then I'll meet you back when we get to the end of the chain. When you've worked your way down the chain pulling up a loop, you should have pulled up 47, and then plus our starting loop would give us 48 loops on our hook. And then we want to connect back to this vertical line on our block, so that back loop behind that first row or that first side stitch. Oops, I split the yarn. There we go. Insert your hook and pull up a loop, and then we can begin our return pass of pull through 2 all the way down this first row. So this is row 1 on the chart, also referred to as our foundation row. So the second row, if we're following the chart, we are going to be doing the knit stitch. So between that front loop and that back loop, into that hole is where we insert our hook to pull up our loop. So we'll just work our way down, pulling up 47 loops, and I will meet you when we get to our line and help you with the connection again. Okay, so I've picked up a loop using the knit stitch, and again we want to connect into that back loop behind the second stitch on our line, and return pass, pull through 2 each time. Okay, so that should be our second row finished with those knit stitches across. Now we're going to look at the chart again for row 3. So we start with 2 knit stitches, then we'll do a reverse stitch and yarn over, 5 TSS, yarn over, 5 reverse stitches, and then that will repeat. So both before and after the 5 reverse stitches will be a yarn over, and then 5 TSS. The yarn over, 5 reverse, yarn over, 5 TSS, and so on. So we can work our way down that. I will show you how that works. So 2 knit stitches to start. So again, going into that space between the front and the back loop of that first stitch and the second stitch for 2 knit stitches. And then the reverse stitch. Remember when we worked our swatch, we want to put our hook behind and go under that back loop to pull up our loop, and then we'll yarn over. And when we yarn over, we skip the stitch underneath and TSS in the next 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 TSS. Then we want to yarn over, skip the stitch, and then we're going to work 5 of those reverse stitches. So picking up the loop on the back. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, followed by a yarn over, skip a stitch. Then we're ready for the 5 TSS stitches again. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yarn over, skip a stitch, then the 5 reverse stitches. Oops. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now you want to be careful after a yarn over when you go to work the reverse stitch that you don't accidentally grab the back of the stitch that we're skipping. So we should see that hole in there by the yarn overs. So just watch for that when we do the TRS, the reverse stitch. Yarn over, skip a stitch, 5 TSS stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yarn over, skip a stitch, 5 reverse stitches. 1, 2, 3. Now on that reverse stitch, I find I need to pull my working yarn a little bit to snug that stitch or it will get too loose. And that is 4 reverse stitches, 1 more, 5, yarn over, skip a stitch, 5 TSS, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we should have 2 stitches left at the end for the 2 knit stitches. So 1 and 2, and then we're ready for our connection stitch. Okay, so you can see you have those yarn overs creating those holes or that open work with 5 stitches in between. Then your connection stitch, as we usually do, in that back loop behind the 3rd row. And then regular return pass, pull through 2 each time. So that's row 3. Then we go back to our chart. And we're always going to be starting with at least 2 of these knit stitches and ending with at least 2 knit stitches on each row. So 2 knit stitches, this time we're going to do a yarn over, and then we need to work into the hole that we created with last round's yarn over. So every time we have a yarn over, the next row will always work into that hole after that. And we'll still have those 5 TSS stitches in between. This next time after we work in the hole, we will do yarn over and only 3 reverse stitches. And then you can see how the next row we only have 1 reverse stitch, and that will help us create sort of a diamond shape as we work through our pattern and then shift it over and so on. So I'll work this row 4 with you right now, and then I'll leave you on your own for a bit and check back in later. But let's do row 4 together. So 2 knit stitches, 1 and 2. And then instead of the reverse stitch, we're going to do a yarn over and skip that stitch, and then we'll work into the hole from the last row yarn over. And then the 5 TSS stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then we have this space from the yarn over, so we know we will work into that hole this round. We'll do a yarn over, skip the next stitch, and then we'll work 3 reverse stitches. 1, 2, and 3. Yarn over, skip this stitch, and then working into the hole, pick up a loop. 5 TSS stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then we see this hole, so we know that's where we pick up our next stitch. Yarn over, skip a stitch, and then 3 reverse stitches. 1, 2, and 3. Yarn over, skip a stitch, and then working in the hole, pick up a loop. 5 TSS stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Working in the hole, pick up a stitch, yarn over, skip a stitch, 3 reverse stitches. 1, 2, and 3. Yarn over, skip a stitch, pick up a stitch in the hole, 5 TSS stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 2 knit stitches. 1 and 2, and then we're ready for that connection on the side again. And ready for our return pass of pull through 2. Okay, so I'll let you to work the next few rounds following the chart carefully, and I will come back and check in with you soon. So how did you do with row number 5? You should be able to start seeing those holes sort of going in together, forming that sort of point or tip shape there. So I recommend putting in a stitch marker at the end of row 5. The chart is divided into 5 row sections with these darker black lines. So I recommend putting in a stitch marker at the end of row 5, row 10, and so on to help find your place as we continue to work through this pattern. So if you've done it, you're looking for sort of these pinkish marks where we work in the hole. You can easily see how those holes are sort of coming together there. So we're going to start shifting our TSS stitches over one stitch each time. So we'll be forming that part, and then it'll shift back the other way as we go the other direction. Okay, so I'd like you to work along on the next 5 rows, and I'll check in with you at the end of row 10. Okay, so after row 10, your work should look something like this. You can see how the TRS section at the beginning sort of came to that little triangle point and now is starting to broaden out on this part. And the TSS section has taken a little turn to zigzag back the other way. I almost missed that on row 9. I was used to doing 6 TSS, and I almost missed where I only needed to do 5 on row 9. So make sure that you got that as well as the TSS begins to shift the other direction. So remember always as you're working to count, count, count. You want to have 48 loops on your hook for each row. Some places that it's easy to miss a stitch or pick up a stitch, I found on the reverse stitches. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to find that stitch next time, but mostly it's on the yarn over stitches that we forget to skip a stitch, and then we pick up an extra stitch on those rows. So just watch for that carefully. You can count the loops as they're on your hook before you do the connection. I prefer to count as I'm doing my return pass, but just watching for that as we work our way through. So take your time, follow those counts carefully in each row, and enjoy. Now, so I finished up to row 21, which is the first page of our chart. So you should be seeing these 2 blocks of the TSS sort of going diagonally with the TRS ones in between those 2 blocks there. So hopefully that is going well for you. So just a reminder that the first page of chart is done once you've hit row 21, but we need to make sure you have the second page, which will continue on with row 22 and all the way up to row 42. So we're halfway there. You'll find the second section here should feel fairly familiar to the first part, as there's some repetition in there. So I'll see you at the end of this block. So as we're getting close to the end of this first block for week 2, hopefully you were able to follow that chart closely enough and have got a design that'll look something like this. We're ready for our last row. And it is basically a row of knit stitches all the way across, just needing to watch where we have that space from the yarn over last round and pick up a loop there as well. So right here's my first space, so picking up a loop there and then just working the knit stitches in each of the remaining stitches. Okay, so once you have all 48 loops on your hook, we will make our connection to that last row on the side here. So it'll be the last row here before the horizontal line starts, and that's where we're connecting. Then work our return pass, pull through 2 all the way down. And then once we finish this return pass, we will work the bind off row as well. And then as we get close to that side edge or our line here, I'm just binding off my final stitch. And then I'll just go in that same as where we made our last connection for the return pass to fasten off. And the first block of week 2 is complete. That was a big one. The next 3 blocks for this week are much smaller, so it should go a little bit quicker. So next we want to work a line. So we're going to be working the vertical line up the side and across the top of this block 5 that we just finished. So we'll connect just at the back of this bottom corner of block 5 and chain 4 to begin our foundation row for the vertical line. Then we turn the chain over, and then working in those back bumps of the chain, we'll just pick up a loop across the row. Sometimes that first chain gets a little bit tight. 1, 2, 3, and 4 loops that we've picked up, so we should have 5 loops on our hook. We make the connection to our first row of block 5, but on that loop that's just on the back beside the edge loops or the border loops of our block 5. And that's the first row for our vertical line. And then we're going to continue all the way up the side of block 5, just working TSS in each of the stitches, connecting to the next side loop, and doing the return pass. So you can go ahead and finish working. When you've worked the vertical line, you should have these 42 rows of the vertical line matching up with the 42 rows on the side of block 5. So once we have done that, what we're going to be doing is picking up our 4 loops across the vertical line, 2, 3, and 4. So we'll have 5 loops on our hook. And then we want to start working on the back side of each of the stitches on the top of block 5 and pull up our loop in the back across the top. So we'll be pulling up another 47 loops. So I'll meet you once we get to the end of this row and meeting up with our other vertical line. So you can go ahead and pull up those loops. So once you've picked up the loops all the way across, you should have 52 loops on your hook, and we will just enter into this next side stitch up on the vertical line from the side from last week. So just the row above where we joined our last row of block 5. And work our return pass. And then once you've completed this return pass, you can work 2 more rows of the simple stitch across and the return pass, and you can go ahead and bind off. Before we work the next few blocks, we just want to set up some markers on this horizontal line we finished to mark where to start our stitches. So the first one, we want to count over 30 stitches. And remember, we're counting these vertical loops just past our connection. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 2, 4, 6, 8, 30. And then we also want to place a marker. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this was the count 30 from the far edge, skip 3 loops and put the marker in the 4th one. So then we just want to count over 1, 2, 3, 4, and on the 5th stitch there we want to place our marker for our last block. So once those are set, we will get ready to join our yarn for block 6. So ready to begin block 6, we can see how it's mostly TSS stitches. The yellow on the chart is the purl stitch and the blue are our knit stitches. So we're going to have 32 stitches in a row. Remembering the 2 outside blocks on the chart are the border stitches, and we'll be picking up 30 loops in between. So we have marked our 30th stitch on the front, and I've just placed an extra marker just in that first back loop where we will start picking up our first loop. And then if you remember from last week, we're going to join our yarn on the back side of this loop that we've marked here. So that's where my green marker is, just to help me find where to place my joining stitch or where to attach my new color. So around the back bar of that 30th stitch, I'm going to attach my color for block 6. And then coming to my other marked loop where I have that horizontal or that extra loop in the back behind my stitch, I'll begin picking up my loops across the top. So I've picked up 1, I've picked up 2 loops, and you see 3 loops on my hook because that's our border stitch, and I've picked up 2 loops. So we'll continue across until we've picked up all 30 loops, which will give us 31 loops on our hook, and I'll meet you just before we connect to the vertical line. Okay, so I've worked my way picking up my loops. I should have 31 loops on my hook. That last one on our last bind off stitch is a little bit harder to find that back loop because of our closing or fasten off, but 31 loops. So then we want to be on this first row of the vertical line going up the side. We will attach to that back loop as well and pick up our 32nd loop, and then we can work our return pass, pull through 2 all the way down the row. So when you've done this return pass, that would be our first row that's on the chart. We're going to work another row of TSS, Tunisian simple stitch as well. So I'll meet you back at the end of row 2. Okay, so I've worked my 2 rows of TSS, and just before we go any further, I just want to remind you about the importance of counting when we're working on these blocks. Somehow on my first row I had miscounted and I'd missed one of the loops to pick up in the back, so make sure you start off with the right number of loops every time on a new block. It's worth taking your time on that first row to get that right. Also, we are going to be doing 12 rows on block number 6, so I have just marked my final connection spot for the 12th row on the side just to make sure I end up correctly as well. So if you want to, you can go ahead and do that. If not, we're going to continue now with the chart. So we have on this first row, so row 3, we have 13 TSS stitches, 2 purl, 1 knit, 2 purl, and then ending the row with TSS as well. So 13 TSS, and then we'll do the 2 purl, the knit, and the 2 purl together. So row 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 TSS stitches. 2 purl. Remembering for the purl stitch, we bring that yarn to the front and turn to the loop, and then yarn over and pull through to pull up that loop. So 2 purl stitches, 1 knit stitch, entering and then going through to the back. So we pull up a loop between the front and the back loop of the stitch, 2 purl, and then finishing the row out with 12 TSS. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 TSS stitches, and joining to that 3rd stitch up the side and beginning our return pass. Okay, so I'll just let you to finish off block number 6, following the chart to make this diamond pattern. And I'll see you back here at the end of the 12th row. So when you finished up block 6, it should look something like this for the design. We do want to make a bind off row across there, and in the bind off row, again connecting or finishing off in the same stitch as our last connection of row 12. So you can go ahead and work that. And once the bind off row is complete, we are going to work another horizontal line just above this block. So you'll start behind that first stitch and then picking up a loop in each of the stitches across. So you'll have the 31 loops on your hook before you connect to this vertical line here. And that'll be your first row and 2 more rows of TSS, just like our other horizontal line. So just starting behind this block and make those 3 rows for the line across the top. So I'll meet you back here after that. Okay, so our second horizontal line is done. You want to make sure you do the bind off row on this line as well. And then we will be ready to start block number 7. So before we work block 7, it's time for a little bit more swatch practice. If you don't have a couple rows of TSS at the end of your swatch, you may want to go work those a couple rows of the simple stitch to prepare for our next stitch learning. So block 7 is going to be designed using this stitch, the star stitch. It's quite a pretty stitch to work. So we just want to practice this. It's a 2-row repeat. So to start, we're going to insert our hook under the next 3 bars and pull up a loop. So we'll have 2 loops on our hook, yarn over, which gives 3 loops on the hook, and we're going to insert our hook under those exact same 3 bars that we did in the first step and pull up a loop, which then gives us the 4 loops on our hook. We'll continue that down the row. So hook goes under 3 loops, pull up a loop, yarn over, under the same 3 loops, and pull up another loop. We'll work that down the row, always remembering to go back under those same 3 loops. So pull up a loop, yarn over, under the same 3 loops, and pull up another loop. And then we'll just make a TSS to finish off, and then our border stitch. Okay, so we should still have our 15 stitches. When we do the return pass, you'll need to be careful to just work one of these at a time off. So we're still going to be pulling through 2 stitches. We just have to be careful when there's the 3 grouped close together that we just go through one of those loops at a time and continue that return pass down the row. Okay, and that's the first step. They don't quite look like stars yet, so this next row is very important to help it turn into more of a star shape. So it's just a regular TSS row, but as we work under these loops and pull them up, the star shape starts to take more shape. And because mine's sort of over 2 rows, you don't see it quite as clearly, but you can see how the star shape is forming between those 2 rows. And then just TSS the last stitch in the border stitch. Okay, so we'll do the return pass and then we'll try those 2 rows again. So under 3 vertical bars, pull up a loop, yarn over, hook under those same 3, pull up another loop, and continue that down the row. And one more time. And the return pass. And always remembering on that return pass to being careful that we don't pull off too many loops in that pull through. And then working that TSS row next to help form, as we pull these loops and sort of separate them a bit, it'll help form that star shape in the loops. And then if you wish, you can continue to work a few more rows of the star stitch, remembering that it's a 2-row pattern to complete the stitch, and working your return pass as well on that until you feel quite comfortable with the star stitch, as we're using that in block 7. So to start block 7, we want to attach on the edge of our horizontal line at the back, picking up those 30 loops across and the border stitch connecting to the next row of this vertical line as well. So that's our foundation row for block 7, and then we can just work our return pass for this row. And we will work another row of straight TSS simple stitch. So I'll let you go ahead and pull up your loops and work another row of simple stitch, and then I'll come back and help you get started with the rest of this block. So my first 2 rows are complete. The first foundation row where we pulled up the loops, and then a row of TSS stitches. Now we want to work an entire row of the Tunisian reverse stitch. So remember, when we do the reverse stitch, we are working on putting our hook through that back vertical bar instead of the front one. And we want to keep the yarn on the other side. There we go. And pull through. So sometimes I reach around behind with my hook to find that vertical bar. Sometimes I find that tricky and I turn my work over so I can see the back side to pick up that vertical bar. So whichever you find easiest, it doesn't matter the method, as long as your hook is going under that back vertical bar. So the back loop, where how we see the front loop that we normally work for TSS, just reversing that in the back. So you can continue to work down the row, all reverse stitches, and making the return pass. So if we're looking at the chart for block 7, we have done the first 3 rows. The first 2 are the TSS, and we just finished this row of the reverse stitch. The symbol used for the star stitch here is in the yellow, and you can see how the symbol here goes across 3 stitches, just to represent that we put our hook under those 3 stitches, remembering we yarn over and then put our hook back under those 3 loops again, and continue on down the row. So we'll just have our border stitches, and the rest of it will be the star stitches down the row. So the rest of this pattern is a 3-row repeat: the star stitch, the TSS row, and then a reverse row. Star, TSS, reverse, star, TSS, reverse. So we'll work this first row of the star stitches together, and I'll meet you back before we do the TSS row. So hook under those first 3 loops, yarn over, pull that loop through, yarn over for an extra loop, then back, putting the hook under those 3 loops again, pulling up a loop. Then going over to the next set of loops, being careful not to skip one of our front loops, pull up a loop, yarn over, back under those same 3 to pull up another loop. We'll continue to work down the side. So we should have a total of 10 times that we work this star stitch. So I've done 3, 4, and this is 9 star stitches, and number 10. And then attaching to the next row up on that vertical line and starting our return pass. Remembering on that return pass to be careful to only remove 1 loop at a time from those star stitches. Those groups of 3 sometimes wants an extra loop to come off. So just work your way down this row for the return pass. So now we just want to work a row of TSS to help those star stitches stand out or take their shape. And this is a great time to make sure that you have picked up 30 loops on the hook for a total of 32 once we make the join at the vertical line. And if not, make sure you go back and fix the star stitch row. So you can work your way down this row making TSS stitches, and I'll meet you here after you work the return pass of this row. Okay, and then we're going to work another row of this TRS, the reverse stitch, all the way along and do the return pass, and then you can continue on in the pattern with the star stitch, the TSS, and the reverse stitch, and so on. So you go ahead and finish up this block, and I'll see you at the end of row 12. So block 7 should look similar to this, with the beautiful textured star stitches and those sort of ridges created by the reverse stitch. Once you have worked all 12 of those rows, please go ahead and do the bind off row as well, and you should have these 3 rows left on the side there from the lines, and we'll be joining to those in a little bit. So now before we work our final block for this week, we want to add this first vertical line starting down beside our block 6 and working up the side of block 6 and 7 for our vertical line. So before we start that, let's just put another marker in. So I left my marker here from block 6, and we want to count over so that there's 3 empty loops and put our marker on the 4th loop. So we will be attaching behind there, picking up a loop in each of these 4 stitches before joining to the side here. So if you want to get that marker ready, and I'll meet you here shortly for the line. Okay, when we pick up loops for this vertical line, we want to remember that we ignore the bind off stitches from the horizontal line, and we come to the front of our work under the loop like a TSS to pull up our 4 loops. And then we find our loop on the back of that first row to connect to and do our return pass. And you can just continue to work this vertical line, working up the side of our work. And you should have 27 rows for this vertical line. And once you get to the top, do not bind off. So when you've finished the 27 rows of this vertical line, don't bind off, as I said, but you can fasten off that color. Block 8, we're going to be making some more cables. So you'll need to find your stitch holder, your cable holder, or your extra crochet hook, whatever you're using for the cables. Last week we made a cable block and all the cables leaned to the right. This week's cable, we're going to have some leaning to the right and some leaning to the left. So in the chart, the dark blue will indicate when it's leaning to the left and the red is to the right. Now to aid with this, you'll see as we start working, when we take the loops off our hook, if it was a TPS stitch, it will sort of naturally fall towards the back, and a TKS will naturally move towards the front of the work. And so when we're using the holder, we will be placing them front or back as they naturally fall. So I'll help you with that as we get there. Let's just take a look at the chart for a minute. As with last week, you can see these cables appear in the return pass. Now, different to last week, we're actually going to work them in the forward pass. It was just easier on the chart to mark them as part of the return pass. So I'm going to be helping you with that as we go through this. So what we will do is work these stitches and pull them off, work these stitches, and then put those right back on again as we're doing the forward pass. So for block 8, we want to attach at this last marker just past our vertical line. So that's in the 5th stitch past the edge of the vertical line. So we will join in the back of that stitch and then pick up our loops across as we have before. So you'll be picking up 13 loops across. So we'll start with our starting loop, pick up 13 loops across, and then connect to this vertical edge for our first row of block 8, and then work our regular return pass. So at the start of your return pass, you should have had 15 loops on your hook, and you want to check that throughout. So that is row 1, or the foundation row on our chart. For the second row, we're going to work 2 TSS, a purl stitch, 6 knit, a purl stitch, and end with 3 TSS. So we'll work row 2, and 3 is the same, so you can go ahead and work rows 2 and 3 right now. So row 2, TSS in 2 stitches, and then we'll work 1 purl stitch the next, and 6 knit stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 1 more purl stitch, and 3 TSS stitches. Make our connection to the second row up on the vertical line. Okay, for row 4, we will start the same way with 2 TSS and a purl stitch. Okay, every row will start this way. And then we're going to make 2 knit stitches. Now this is the start of our cable, so we're going to remove those 2 stitches as we're going to cross those over the purl stitches we make next. So you can see how I remove them from my hook, they fall to the front, and that's exactly where we will place the cable holder, is on the front of our work. Okay, and then we need to work on our purl stitches. Be careful, we've already worked the knit stitch in that loop, so we're not going to use that one. We'll make the purl stitches next, 1 and 2, and then we'll cross these cables, or put these stitches back on our hook to form, our cable, and we'll see that better in the return pass. And then we'll make 2 more knit stitches, and then finish off the row, and these last 4 stitches are the same every row of this block, a purl stitch and 3 TSS stitches. And then make our connection to that vertical line and start our return pass. Now we'll take off these first 4 stitches that are always the same, the 3 TSS and the purl. Then we had 2 more stitches, those 2 knit stitches, and now we've reached where we've made our cable. So we need to be careful that we're only taking off 1 loop at a time, and in between these first 2 loops, which are the knit stitches that we crossed over, we're going to add an extra pull through 1, or a chain 1, before we take off the purl stitches. So return pass 1, and those 2 crossed knit stitches, and then chain 1, and then we'll take off those 2 purl stitches that crossed behind. And that chain 1 just gives a bit extra room to allow for that crossing instead of pulling our work. And that's our first cable for this block. And then row 5, always starting with those 2 TSS and a purl stitch. Then we'll knit in the next 6, so you have to be careful here. Those purl stitches are behind our work a little bit. 1 knit and 2 knit, and then in these cross stitches here, 3 and 4, and then followed by 2 more knit right here, and then do our ending 4 stitches of the purl stitch and the 3 TSS. And again, connect to that vertical line. and work the return pass. And then you can see better now our first cable for this block. Okay, so that is the first 5 rows of block 8. I'm going to help you work row 6, and then it's just going to be a repeat of those 2 cables with the 6 knit stitch in between each of the cable rows. So let's work row 6 together, and then you can finish off block 8. So row 6, as always, starts with those 2 TSS stitches and then a purl stitch. Now we're going to work 2 knit stitches, 1 and 2, and then 2 purl stitches. Now these 2 purl stitches are the ones that we're going to use for our cable. So after we've worked the 2 purl, we'll slip them off our hook, and you can see how they naturally fall towards the back. So we put them on our cable holder and lay them across the back, and then working 2 knit stitches, 1 and 2, and then put these 2 purl stitches back on our hook. And finish off our usual 4 stitches with the purl stitch and 3 TSS. Okay, then we're almost ready to work that return pass again, remembering when we get to these cable stitches to add that extra chain 1 or pull through 1 in between those 2 pairs. So connection to the vertical line, 2, 3, and 4. So those are our 4 stitches on that side, and then we'll work 2 more, pull through 1 and 2, plus that chain 1, and then we'll pull off those crossed knit stitches and finish our return pass. And then you can see how we have this cable that is leaning to the left, and the cable we just made is leaning to the right. Okay, so you will have this row of crisscrossing left, right cables continuing up to look something like this. So again, if you wish, putting a marker at the edge of every 5th row to keep your place on your work as you're working your way through the chart. And then I'll meet you back here at the end of this block. So last week I showed you working the cables in the return pass, and I have shown you how to do it in the forward pass on this block 8. The designer finds it easier to do in the forward pass. You may be like that as well, or you may find the return pass to be easier. It doesn't matter for this crochet along which way you do it, in the return or the forward pass. So I'm just going to show you, I'm on row 10 right now, and I'm just going to show you what this particular block looks like if you're working the cable in the return pass. So I've picked up my stitches according to the chart with the knit and the purl in that order. I'm going to take off those first 4 stitches of my return pass as per the chart, and then the cable in round 10 is worked closer to this edge. So then, like we did last week, we'll remove the 5 stitches from the hook. These are purl stitches leaning towards the back, so I'll put them on my cable holder to the back, put the 2 knit stitches back on my hook, bring these forward onto the hook, and add the return pass back on. And then we will take off those 2 cross stitches work our chain 1 and take off the next 2 stitches of the cable, and then finish our return pass. Okay, so it doesn't make a difference in the look of the cable, the finished cable, just whichever way seems to be easier for you. And there's block 8. Hope that went okay for you. So now that we've finished block 8, we will work our final vertical line and then work across the top and finish up the top with our horizontal line. So you will attach just behind where we finished the top of our previous vertical line and just over from where we started block 8. So on the border in behind, you attach your yarn, and then we'll just work TSS across those 4 stitches that we haven't worked yet. So picking up 4 more loops, working across, and then we'll make that connection in the back bump of the very first row of block 1 and finish our return pass. And then we'll just continue to work rows of TSS, working up the side of block 8 until we connect to the top or the last row of block 8. And I will meet you there and help you get started to work the horizontal line across the top. So rows of TSS connecting to the side of block 8 until we reach the top. So when we finish the vertical line, we're going to want to make sure we do not bind off or fasten off, and we're going to start working the horizontal line across the top. So we'll start by picking up these 4 loops from the vertical line. And then on top of block 8, we're going to pick up those 13 loops. So just working in that back loop or bump, we will pick up across the row our 13 loops. And then we'll pick up the 4 loops across this next vertical line, remembering to work it like a TSS. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then across the top of this next square, we will pick up those loops. 30 loops, I believe, on the top of this one. So once you've picked up all of your loops, you should have 52 loops on your hook, and then you will just make your connection to the third row from the top, on this horizontal line from last week. So just make our connection and work the regular return pass, and then you can work 2 more rows of TSS plus the bind off row, and that will complete week 2. So as we're finishing up our bind off row, we're going to make that last connection just towards the top and in the back of that vertical line from last week, and then finish off. And congratulations, week 2 is finished. Now week 1 and 2 have formed one large square, and that could be used as a cushion cover if you prefer. We're going to start the first part of the second large square next week, and can't wait to see you back here then.